Nagasaki Harbor, November 1940, 3 in the morning. The fog rolls in from the East China Sea, thick and gray, settling over the water like a shroud. The moon has already set. Streetlights cast weak circles of yellow light onto empty roads. The only sounds are the lapping of waves against the harbor walls and the distant hum of activity from the shipyard. The city sleeps, but something is happening down by the shipyard. Nearly 2,000 soldiers, secret police, and sailors have quietly surrounded the district since nightfall. Every window facing the water has been shuttered by government order. Anyone caught looking toward the harbor will be arrested. Some will simply disappear. Behind a curtain of woven hemp rope weighing over 400 tons, stretching 75,000 square meters across the shipyard, something massive waits in the darkness. Something so secret that blueprints are guarded around the clock. Workers who glimpsed even fragments of the design have sworn oaths of silence on pain of imprisonment. One draftsman who accidentally threw away a technical drawing spent 3 years in prison after an investigation involving torture. At precisely 8:55 a.m., with dawn barely breaking over the bay, a ship slides into the water. The splash creates a wave nearly 4 feet high. It rushes through the shallow harbor, capsizing small boats, flooding streets, pouring into shops and homes. Residents rush outside to see what has happened, only to be forced back by armed guards. Nothing to see here. Go back inside. The ship now floating in Nagasaki Harbor is the Musashi, one half of the largest pair of battleships ever constructed in human history, built by a company whose name appears on products you probably touched today, whose logo, 3 red diamonds, adorns everything from cars to air conditioners to the pencils in your desk drawer. Mitsubishi. The name means 3 diamonds in Japanese, a simple corporate logo, an instantly recognizable brand. But behind those 3 interlocking shapes lies a story that spans 155 years, 3 wars, countless scandals, and a pattern of secrecy so deeply woven into the company's DNA that untangling it feels almost impossible. Mitsubishi built the engines of Japanese imperialism. They manufactured the fighters that attacked Pearl Harbor. They profited from forced labor that killed hundreds, maybe thousands, of conscripted workers from Korea and China. They covered up deadly vehicle defects for decades, leading to deaths they refused to acknowledge. They cheated on emissions tests for 25 years. And yet, Mitsubishi also helped modernize Japan. They built infrastructure that lifted millions out of poverty. They pioneered technologies that changed how the world moves, communicates, and produces energy. Today, their combined companies generate nearly 8% of all revenue from publicly traded Japanese firms. Their assets exceed 400 trillion yen. So which is it? Industrial pioneer or war profiteer? Innovator or deceiver? Corporate citizen or shadow empire? The answer, as always, is more complicated than any single label allows. And it begins with a young man who spent 7 months in prison for accusing a magistrate of corruption. His name was Yataro Iwasaki, and he would build an empire. The year was 1835. On January 9th, in a small farming village in what is now Kochi Prefecture, on the island of Shikoku, a boy was born who would reshape Japanese capitalism. His family had a complicated relationship with status. The Iwasakis had once been samurai, members of Japan's warrior nobility, holders of swords and land and honor. But generations earlier, during the devastating Tenmei famine that killed hundreds of thousands across Japan, Yataro's great-great-grandfather had been forced to sell the family's samurai status to cover crushing debts. The transaction was permanent. From that point forward, the Iwasakis were farmers. Respectable, yes, but powerless. In the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan, where birth determined destiny, the Iwasakis had fallen from the class that ruled to the class that served. This fact ate at young Yataro like acid on steel. He grew up ambitious, restless, and perpetually dissatisfied with his circumstances. His family was reasonably well off by farming standards, but Yataro understood something that would drive him for the rest of his life. In Japan, wealth without status meant nothing. True power came from connections, from education, from moving in circles that farmers could never enter. So he studied, voraciously. The written word was his ladder out of obscurity. At 19, Yataro traveled to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, to continue his education. He had secured a position accompanying an official from the Tosa domain, one of the most powerful merchant clans of the era. This was his chance to prove himself, to network with influential people, to begin the long climb back to significance. A year later, everything fell apart. Word reached Edo that Yataro's father had been seriously injured in a dispute with the village headman back home. The details are murky, lost to time, but the result was clear. Yataro's father needed help, and the local authorities were refusing to provide it. Yataro rushed home. He demanded justice. The local magistrate refused to hear the case, likely because the headman had connections that a farmer's son lacked. What happened next would define Yataro's character. He publicly accused the magistrate of corruption. For this, Yataro was thrown in prison for 7 months. When he emerged, he was unemployable, a marked man in a society where challenging authority meant social death. He drifted for years, taking odd jobs, tutoring children, slowly rebuilding connections through sheer force of personality. What happened next would shape the trajectory of Japanese capitalism. Yataro eventually found work with the Tosa clan, one of the most powerful merchant organizations of the era. They posted him to Nagasaki, the trading port where Japan conducted its limited commerce with the outside world during the final years of isolation. Here, Yataro learned to negotiate with foreign merchants. He studied Western business practices. He developed relationships with traders from Britain, America, and the Netherlands. And then, in 1868, everything changed. The Meiji Restoration was one of the most dramatic political upheavals in modern history. In a matter of months, 2.5 centuries of shogunate rule collapsed. The young Emperor Meiji, just 16 years old, was restored to nominal power. The samurai class that had dominated Japan was abolished. The feudal domains that had divided the country into semi-autonomous territories were dissolved. Ancient privileges evaporated overnight. The new imperial government looked around at the world and saw danger everywhere. China, once the greatest civilization in Asia, had been humiliated by Western powers in the Opium Wars. India had been conquered by Britain. Africa was being carved up by European colonial powers. Everywhere the men of Meiji looked, they saw a clear pattern: industrialize or be colonized. Japan had been isolated from the world for over 200 years. Now it had to catch up in 2 decades or face destruction. The government threw open the doors. Western advisors flooded in. Railroads were built. Telegraph lines strung. Factories erected. Students were sent abroad to learn engineering, medicine, law, military tactics. The entire society was being remade at breakneck speed, tearing down the old to build something that could survive in a world of steamships and rifles and global empires. This chaos was Yataro's opportunity. The Tosa clan, like all the feudal domains, was being dissolved. Their business operations, including shipping and trading ventures, needed to be liquidated. Someone had to manage the process. Someone with experience dealing with foreign merchants. Someone who understood Western business practices. Yataro had spent years in Nagasaki doing exactly that. When the Meiji government dissolved the Tosa clan's business operations, Yataro was placed in charge of liquidating their assets. He had the ships. He had the contracts. He had the relationships with foreign traders. What he didn't have was any intention of simply closing up shop. Through a series of maneuvers that combined genuine business acumen with shameless opportunism, Yataro transformed his position as liquidator into ownership. He assumed responsibility for the clan's outstanding debts, which gave foreign merchants confidence in his integrity. He acquired the ships that had belonged to the trading operation. He maintained the commercial relationships that had been built over years. By 1870, he controlled a small shipping company with 3 aging steamships. He named it Tsukumo Shokai. Within 3 years, he had renamed it again, Mitsubishi. The word combines 2 Japanese terms, Mitsu, meaning 3, and Hishi, a water chestnut plant whose fruit is diamond-shaped. The name literally means 3 diamonds, a reference to the logo that Yataro created by combining his family crest with the 3-leaf crest of the Tosa clan. 3 overlapping diamond shapes. Red, the color of good fortune in Japanese culture, the same red that appears on Japan's flag. A symbol that would soon appear on ships, on buildings, on products sold around the world. The company that would reshape Japanese industry had been born in the chaos of revolution. In those early years, Yataro made a decision that would define Mitsubishi's relationship with the Japanese state for the next century and a half. He tied his fortunes directly to the government. In 1874, the Meiji government planned a military expedition to Taiwan. They needed ships to transport troops. Foreign shipping companies refused the contract, not wanting to involve themselves in Japan's colonial adventures. Yataro stepped forward. He provided the vessels. He moved the soldiers. And when the expedition was over, The grateful government gave him the ships they had purchased for the operation, plus a substantial annual subsidy. This was the Mitsubishi business model taking shape. Provide what the government needs, align corporate interests with national interests, become indispensable. 3 years later, when samurai in the South launched a rebellion against the new order, Mitsubishi transported the government troops that crushed them. More ships, more subsidies, more trust. By the early 1880s, Mitsubishi dominated Japanese shipping. They had driven foreign competitors out of key routes. They carried mail for the government. They moved goods and people across an island nation rapidly embracing industrialization. But Yataro wasn't satisfied with ships. In 1881, Mitsubishi purchased the Takashima coal mine. In 1890, they acquired a tiny island called Hashima, barely 16 acres of rock jutting from the sea off Nagasaki. The island had coal beneath it, rich veins of black gold that extended far beneath the seafloor. That coal could fuel the steamships that were becoming Mitsubishi's lifeblood. Hashima doesn't look like much from a distance. A craggy rock, barely half a kilometer long and less than 200 meters wide, rising from the waves about 15 kilometers from Nagasaki harbor. The original island was even smaller. Mitsubishi expanded it through land reclamation, building seawalls and filling in the gaps until the habitable area had nearly tripled. What made Hashima valuable wasn't its surface. It was what lay beneath. The coal seams ran deep beneath the ocean floor, extending in some cases more than a kilometer down. To reach them, miners descended through vertical shafts into a world of perpetual darkness, crushing heat and constant danger. The tunnels were narrow. The air was thick with coal dust. The temperature exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity approached 100%. Men worked in those tunnels for hours at a time, hacking at the coalface with hand tools, loading the chunks into carts, then hauling them back to the surface. One wrong move, one collapsed support beam, one pocket of explosive gas, and the tunnel became a tomb. Mitsubishi needed workers who would endure those conditions. They found them first, among Japanese miners, drawn by wages that were, by the standards of the time, relatively good. As the operation expanded, they built housing on the island. Japan's first reinforced concrete high-rise apartment buildings went up on Hashima in 1916, not as architectural experiments, but as practical solutions to the problem of housing thousands of workers on a tiny rock. By the 1950s, over 5,000 people lived on Hashima. The population density exceeded anything else on Earth. Workers and their families crowded into small apartments. Children went to school on the island. Shops and restaurants served the community. There was even a movie theater. From above, the island looked like a battleship, its concrete buildings rising like gun turrets from the deck. That's how it got its nickname, Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. But the history of Hashima has another chapter, one that Mitsubishi would prefer to forget. What happened on that island during the war would not become widely known for nearly a century. But we'll get there. Yataro also leased the Nagasaki shipyard from the government in 1884, renaming it the Nagasaki Shipyard and Machinery Works. Now Mitsubishi wasn't just operating ships. They were building and repairing them too. Vertical integration, control the supply chain, reduce dependence on others. This was the pattern. Shipping led to coal mining, led to shipbuilding, led to insurance, led to banking, led to real estate, led to chemicals, led to aircraft, led to automobiles. Each venture connected to the others, each one making the whole more powerful. Yataro Iwasaki died in 1885, just 50 years old, of stomach cancer. He never saw the merger of his shipping operations with a rival company to form NYK Line. He never saw Mitsubishi become the juggernaut it would become. But he had set the trajectory. His brother Yanosuke took over, then Yataro's son, Hisaya, then his nephew Koyata. 4 presidents from the same family, guiding Mitsubishi from the Meiji era through 2 world wars. Each one adding new industries, each one deepening the company's ties to the Japanese government. By the 1890s, Mitsubishi had acquired something that would define Tokyo's landscape for the next century. The government needed money for military construction, so they sold a vast tract of land between the Imperial Palace and Tokyo Station. Nobody wanted to pay what the government was asking, except Mitsubishi. Yanosuke Iwasaki purchased the land. Remembering his youthful visits to Manhattan, he envisioned something unprecedented, a Western-style business district in the heart of Japan's capital. The Marunouchi district was born. Today, Mitsubishi Estate still controls much of it. The land alone is worth tens of billions of dollars. As the 19th century became the 20th, Mitsubishi kept diversifying. They founded banks, insurance companies, chemical plants, steel mills. They funded the establishment of an optics company that would later become Nikon. They invested in electricity, petroleum, atomic energy, space exploration. But they also built weapons, and they built them very, very well. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a set of specifications that seemed impossible to meet. They wanted a new carrier-based fighter that could outperform any land-based opponent. It had to be highly maneuverable. It had to have exceptional range, capable of flying escort missions far from its carrier. It had to be fast, well-armed, and easy to maintain. Two companies received the specifications, Nakajima and Mitsubishi. Nakajima's engineers looked at the requirements and concluded they were unrealistic. No aircraft could meet all those demands simultaneously. They dropped out of the competition. Mitsubishi's lead designer, Jiro Horikoshi, saw things differently. Horikoshi understood that the Navy's specifications required trade-offs. You couldn't have everything. Something had to give. The question was what? His answer was revolutionary: sacrifice protection for performance. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had no armor. The pilot sat in an unprotected cockpit, shielded from enemy fire by nothing but thin aluminum skin. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, meaning that a single bullet in the right place would turn the aircraft into a fireball. The landing gear was fixed, adding drag but simplifying the design. Every ounce of weight that could be eliminated was eliminated. The result was an aircraft that weighed just over 5,000 pounds, far lighter than any comparable fighter. That weight savings translated into performance. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than anything it faced. The first prototype flew in April 1939. After minor adjustments, it met or exceeded every Navy requirement. Production began the following year. The Zero entered combat over China in the summer of 1940. The results were devastating. In September 1940, 13 Zeros encountered 30 Chinese fighters over Chongqing. The Chinese pilots were flying Soviet-built aircraft, I-15 and I-16 fighters, that represented the best available technology from another major military power. 27 Chinese planes were shot down. 0 losses, none. Through September 1941, Zeros operating over China shot down or destroyed on the ground 99 enemy aircraft. The cost: 2 Zeros lost to anti-aircraft fire. Reports of the Zero's capabilities filtered back to American military intelligence. They were met with skepticism. Western experts had long assumed that Japanese aircraft were inferior copies of Western designs, that Japanese pilots lacked the skill for serious aerial combat. The idea that Japan could produce a fighter superior to anything in the American arsenal seemed absurd. This prejudice would prove catastrophic. On December 7, 1941, Zero fighters provided air cover for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Over the following months, they dominated every opponent they faced in the skies over the Pacific. American pilots learned the hard way that engaging a Zero in a turning dogfight was suicide. The Japanese planes could outturn anything, could stay in the air longer than seemed possible, could pursue and destroy aircraft that thought they had escaped. New tactics had to be developed. American pilots learned to use superior speed and altitude, to dive on Zeros from above and zoom away before the Japanese pilot could respond. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver one. Hit and run. Boom and zoom. Commander John Thatch developed the Thatch Weave, a defensive formation that allowed American pilots to protect each other against the more maneuverable Japanese fighters. It worked, but it was an acknowledgement that one-on-one, the Zero was simply better. Mitsubishi built over 3,000 Zeros at their factories. Another 7,000 were built under license by Nakajima. By war's end, more than 10,000 had been produced, more than any other Japanese combat aircraft. Japan produced more Zeros than any other type of military plane during the entire war. As the conflict dragged on, the Zero's weaknesses became liabilities. American aircraft improved. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in 1943 with an engine that produced nearly twice the horsepower of the Zero's power plant. The Hellcat could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. The Zero could not. Japanese pilots died at rates that could not be sustained. Unlike the Americans, who rotated experienced pilots home to train new ones, Japan kept its best pilots in combat until they were killed. By 1944, the quality of Japanese pilots had declined dramatically while American pilot quality continued to improve. The Zero remained in production because nothing better was available. Mitsubishi developed successor designs, but production problems and engine shortages kept them from reaching the front in significant numbers. In the final months of the war, many of those final Zeros were converted for a specific purpose: kamikaze attacks. Out of 2,363 Japanese Navy aircraft used in suicide missions, 1,189 were Mitsubishi Zeros. The fighter that had dominated the early Pacific War ended its service diving into American ships, carrying pilots on one-way missions. The planes that helped start the Pacific War also helped end it, in flames over the decks of American carriers and destroyers. But the Zero wasn't Mitsubishi's most impressive wartime creation. That honor belongs to the Musashi. The battleship represented an entirely different kind of ambition. Where the Zero was designed for agility and efficiency, the Musashi was designed for pure, overwhelming power. If the Zero was a rapier, the Musashi was a sledgehammer. Construction began in March 1938 at the same Nagasaki shipyard that Yataro Iwasaki had acquired 50 years earlier. The ship would be one of two Yamato-class battleships, the largest and most powerfully armed warships ever built. These vessels represented Japan's answer to a fundamental strategic problem. They couldn't outbuild the Americans, so they would out-engineer them. The theory was simple. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. In a prolonged war of attrition, Japan would inevitably run out of ships before the Americans did. So instead of trying to match American quantity, Japan would build vessels of such overwhelming quality that each one could defeat multiple opponents. It was a rational strategy, rooted in accurate assessments of relative industrial strength. It was also already obsolete before construction began. The secrecy surrounding the project was extraordinary, even by Japanese standards. The Imperial Navy classified the ships as super secret. Workers were vetted by secret police before being allowed near the construction sites. Technical documents required multiple levels of authorization to access. Anyone found discussing the project could face severe punishment. At the Nagasaki shipyard, the entire construction area was hidden behind a massive curtain of woven hemp rope. The curtain weighed over 400 tons and stretched 75,000 square meters across the facility. From outside the yard, you couldn't see what was being built. The secrecy was so tight that it created its own problems. Mitsubishi purchased such enormous quantities of hemp rope that the market price spiked, attracting attention from merchants who wondered what was happening. They also bought the Glover Mansion and several other buildings on high ground overlooking the shipyard, simply to prevent anyone from having a vantage point. When a single blueprint went missing in 1938, the investigation was intense. Dozens of suspects were interrogated. Some were tortured. Eventually, a draftsman was found to have accidentally thrown away the document while cleaning. He spent 3 years in prison for his carelessness. The specifications were staggering. The Musashi displaced nearly 73,000 tons fully loaded, roughly twice the weight of contemporary American battleships. Her 9 main guns, each 18.1 inches in diameter, were the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a ship. Each gun turret weighed 2,774 tons, more than an entire destroyer of the era. The shells they fired weighed over 3,000 pounds and could theoretically reach targets 26 miles away. The armor was equally impressive. Belt armor 16 inches thick, deck armor more than 8 inches in places. The turrets themselves were protected by armor over 2 feet thick. The ship was designed to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser vessels and keep fighting. Launching the Musashi presented unique challenges. The ship was so heavy that traditional launch methods wouldn't work. Engineers designed a special launch platform 4 meters thick, made of 9 layers of Douglas fir bolted together. It took 2 years just to drill the bolt holes through that much wood. On November 1, 1940, the launch took place in total secrecy. It happened in the early morning hours, before dawn. Residents of Nagasaki were ordered to stay indoors. Nearly 2,000 soldiers, police, and sailors patrolled the streets to ensure compliance. The handful of dignitaries present included Navy Minister Okawa Koshiro and a representative of the imperial family. There was no celebration, no champagne, no cheering crowds, just a quiet ceremony, a brief prayer, and the ship sliding into the water. The splash created a wave nearly 4 feet high. It swept through the shallow harbor, capsizing small boats and flooding nearby streets. Residents who rushed outside to see what had happened were forced back indoors by armed guards. "Nothing to see here. Go back inside." Immediately after the launch, A large passenger liner was towed alongside the Musashi to block any view of the ship's silhouette. The secrecy had to be maintained. Fitting out took nearly 2 more years. The massive guns had to be transported from Kure, where they were manufactured, on specially built cargo ships. The complex fire control systems had to be installed and calibrated. Thousands of crew members had to be trained to operate the most sophisticated warship ever built. Mitsubishi had built a floating fortress. On August 5, 1942, the Musashi was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued, appropriate for wartime. The ship immediately became the flagship of the combined fleet, replacing her sister ship, Yamato. For the next 2 years, the Musashi spent most of her time anchored at Truk Lagoon, the major Japanese naval base in the Pacific. She was too valuable to risk in ordinary operations. Her fuel consumption was enormous. Her presence was needed as a deterrent, a reminder of Japanese naval power. When she finally sailed into battle, it was already too late. But there was a cost that wouldn't be acknowledged for decades. Building the Musashi required labor. So did mining the coal that powered Mitsubishi's operations. So did all the factories producing weapons for Japan's war machine. And as the war dragged on, as more Japanese men were drafted into military service, that labor became harder to find. The solution was forced conscription. Beginning in the late 1930s and accelerating through the war years, hundreds of thousands of Koreans and tens of thousands of Chinese were brought to Japan against their will. Korea had been a Japanese colony since 1910. China was being invaded. The people of both nations were treated as resources to be exploited. The process was systematic. Labor recruiters, sometimes working with local authorities, would sweep through villages in Korea and occupied China. Young men, sometimes teenagers, would be told they were being recruited for work that would benefit the empire. Some were promised good wages, some were simply taken. They were loaded onto ships and transported to Japan. They had no say in their destination. They had no rights. They were, for all practical purposes, slaves. Many ended up working for Mitsubishi. On Hashima Island, the coal mine that Mitsubishi had purchased in 1890, conditions were brutal beyond description. The conscripted laborers were housed separately from Japanese workers, in cramped dormitories that offered neither privacy nor comfort. Food was scarce. Rice was rationed. Many workers suffered from malnutrition. Each day they descended into the mines. Picture it: a vertical shaft dropping hundreds of meters into the earth, then tunnels extending beneath the ocean floor. The walls wept moisture. The air was thick with coal dust that coated the lungs with every breath. Temperatures exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity approached saturation. Electric lights barely penetrated the darkness. Men worked in teams, hacking at the coal face with picks and shovels. The technology was primitive. The danger was constant. Cave-ins happened. Gas explosions happened. Men were crushed, suffocated, burned. When they emerged from the mines, exhausted and covered in coal dust, there was no escape from the island. The sea surrounded them. Patrol boats watched for anyone attempting to flee. The mainland was 15 kilometers away, across cold and treacherous currents. Some tried anyway. There are accounts of workers leaping into the ocean, trying to swim to freedom. Most drowned. A few reached the mainland, only to be recaptured and returned. The punishments for escape attempts were severe. How many died on Hashima? Japanese sources estimate around 137. Korean researchers put the number closer to 1,300. The discrepancy reflects fundamental disagreements about how deaths were recorded, who counted as a forced laborer, and what conditions actually prevailed on the island. The true count may never be known. Records were destroyed. Witnesses died. The company that operated the mines had every incentive to minimize the documented toll. What we know is this: people were brought to Hashima against their will. They worked in conditions that were dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. Many did not survive. Those who did carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Similar scenes played out across Mitsubishi's operations, at coal mines, at shipyards, at factories producing weapons for the war effort. Forced laborers built the ships that transported Japanese armies. They manufactured the aircraft that bombed Chinese cities. They dug the coal that powered the entire war machine. According to one estimate, Japan forcibly mobilized nearly 800,000 Koreans to work at over 1,500 sites across the empire. Over 10% of those workers are estimated to have died or disappeared. The precise numbers for Mitsubishi's operations are unclear. but they involved thousands of people across multiple facilities. In 2015, Mitsubishi Materials formally apologized to American prisoners of war who had been forced to work in the company's mines during the war. Approximately 12,000 Americans were exploited as slave laborers by Japanese companies. Over 1,000 of them died. The company expressed sincere apologies regarding its historical responsibility to the former laborers. But American POWs represented only a fraction of the forced labor story. The Chinese and Korean workers, far more numerous and often treated even worse, remained largely unacknowledged. This history would remain largely hidden for half a century. Then, slowly, the survivors began to speak. In October 1944, the Musashi sailed into the Battle of Leyte Gulf as part of the largest naval engagement in history. American carrier aircraft found the Japanese fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave attacked. The Musashi absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes. For hours, she refused to sink. Her crew fought fires, shored up flooding compartments, kept firing her massive guns at the swarming aircraft. Finally, at 7:35 p.m. on October 24th, the great battleship rolled over and sank. Over 1,000 of her crew went down with her. The survivors were rescued by other Japanese ships. The largest warship Mitsubishi ever built lies today in 3,000 feet of water, a tomb for the men who served on her, and a monument to a kind of warfare that was already obsolete before she was launched. The battleship era ended not with a great naval engagement, but with aircraft that could strike from hundreds of miles away. Mitsubishi had built the ultimate expression of a dying technology. 7 months later, the war ended. Japan lay in ruins. Nagasaki, where the Musashi had been built, had been destroyed by an atomic bomb. Tokyo was a wasteland of rubble and ash. And the American occupiers had a plan for companies like Mitsubishi. On October 20th, 1945, barely 2 months after Japan's surrender, the Allied occupation authorities ordered the dissolution of the Zaibatsu, the massive family-controlled conglomerates that had dominated the Japanese economy. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Yasuda, and others were to be broken apart. Their holding companies dissolved, their family owners stripped of their shares. The reasoning was straightforward. These conglomerates had bankrolled Japan's military expansion. They had profited from aggression. They had been too intertwined with the government to allow genuine democracy to flourish. Mitsubishi was the only major zaibatsu to initially resist. Koyata Iwasaki, the fourth president of the Mitsubishi Empire, protested the order. On his deathbed, he insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he had served his country faithfully. But the occupation authorities were unmoved. Mitsubishi was broken into pieces. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was split into 3 separate companies. The trading arm was divided, the bank was separated. For a moment, it seemed like the end of the Mitsubishi story. It wasn't. The Cold War changed everything. By the early 1950s, American priorities had shifted. The Soviet Union loomed. Communist China had emerged. Korea was at war. Suddenly, a weak Japan seemed less desirable than a strong one. The occupation's earlier zeal for dismantling Japan's industrial base gave way to a new policy: rebuild, rearm, resist communism. The zaibatsu began to reform. They couldn't reconstitute exactly as before. The holding companies were gone, the family control was broken, but the pieces remained, and they began to cooperate again through a new structure called keiretsu. In 1952, an incident accelerated Mitsubishi's reunion. 2 men with connections to the Yakuza attempted to take over Yowa Real Estate, one of the successor companies that controlled valuable Marunouchi property. They bought shares cheaply and threatened a hostile takeover. Other Mitsubishi companies had to band together to buy them out at inflated prices. The lesson was clear. Separated, the former Mitsubishi companies were vulnerable. Together, they could defend themselves. In 1954, Mitsubishi Corporation was reformed through a merger of the trading companies that had been split apart. The same year, the Mitsubishi Friday Club was established, a monthly meeting where executives from major Mitsubishi companies would gather to coordinate strategy. By 1964, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries had also reunified. The scattered pieces were becoming whole again. But this wasn't the old Mitsubishi. There was no family patriarch at the top, no single controlling entity. Instead, the new Mitsubishi was a web of independent companies linked by cross-shareholding, shared history, and mutual support. Each company was technically autonomous. Each one owned portions of the others. They met monthly at the Friday conference to discuss common interests. 29 major companies participate in these meetings today. They call the three most important, the three great houses: MUFG Bank, Japan's largest bank; Mitsubishi Corporation, the giant trading company; Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the defense contractor and manufacturer. Together, these companies and their affiliates generate nearly 8% of all revenue from publicly traded Japanese firms. Their combined assets exceed 433 trillion yen. They employ hundreds of thousands of people. They operate in virtually every major industry. The Zaibatsu was dead. The Keiretsu had risen in its place. And the three red diamonds were everywhere. The difference between the old Zaibatsu and the new Keiretsu was subtle but significant. The Zaibatsu had been centrally controlled. A holding company sat at the top, owned by a family, directing the activities of subsidiaries below. It was hierarchical, patriarchal, concentrated. The Keiretsu was something else, a network rather than a pyramid, a web of mutual support rather than a chain of command. In a horizontal Keiretsu like Mitsubishi, dozens of independent companies share a common identity and history. Each company has its own board of directors, its own shareholders, its own management, but they also own stock in each other, creating a web of interlocking ownership that ties them together. When one company faces trouble, the others can step in to help. When an outside force threatens the group, they can coordinate their response. When opportunities arise, they can work together to seize them. The monthly Friday conference became the nerve center of this coordination. On the second Friday of each month, the most senior executives from major Mitsubishi companies gather for lunch. Officially, it's a social function. Since 1993, under pressure from critics who saw potential antitrust violations, the meetings have been declared purely informal. But everyone in Japanese business knows that the Friday conference is where Mitsubishi policy takes shape, where companies compare notes, where decisions get made, even if they're never formally voted on. 29 companies currently participate in the Friday conference. 10 others rotate in and out. The three most important companies, the three great houses, meet separately before each conference to coordinate positions. MUFG Bank, Japan's largest financial institution. Mitsubishi Corporation, one of the world's largest trading companies, with operations spanning energy, metals, machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the defense contractor and manufacturer that traces its lineage directly to the shipyard Yataro Iwasaki acquired in 1884. Together, these three companies anchor the entire Mitsubishi network. The bank provides financing. The trading company connects the group to global markets. Heavy Industries provides the industrial muscle. Below them, a constellation of companies covers virtually every sector of the economy. Mitsubishi Electric builds everything from satellites to air conditioners. Mitsubishi Chemical produces materials used in countless products. Mitsubishi Estate controls prime real estate in Tokyo and across Japan. Mitsubishi Motors makes cars. Nikon makes cameras. Kirin makes beer. Some companies don't even use the Mitsubishi name. AGC, formerly Asahi Glass, produces glass for buildings and vehicles worldwide. But it participates in the Friday conference. It's part of the network. The combined reach is staggering. A 2020 estimate concluded that all Mitsubishi-affiliated companies together generate nearly 8% of total revenue from publicly traded Japanese firms. Their combined assets exceed 433 trillion yen. That's roughly equivalent to the GDP of the United Kingdom. This is the modern Mitsubishi, not a company but an ecosystem, not a corporation but a community of interest, legally independent but practically interconnected in ways that outsiders struggle to understand. But the new Mitsubishi carried something forward from the old one, something that would cause problems for decades: a culture of secrecy. In July 2000, Japanese regulators received a tip. Someone inside Mitsubishi Motors was talking. The informant led investigators to a cache of hidden documents marked secret, concealed in a location the company had thought was secure. What they found was staggering. For over 2 decades, Mitsubishi Motors had been systematically concealing customer complaints and safety defects. When customers reported problems, brakes that failed, fuel systems that leaked, clutches that malfunctioned, the reports were logged and filed. But they weren't reported to regulators as required by law. They weren't addressed through recalls as required by common sense. Instead, the company had developed an elaborate system for quietly making problems disappear. When vehicles came in for routine service, technicians would check for known defects and fix them silently. No recall notice, no acknowledgement of a problem, just a quiet repair and a customer who never knew their car had been defective. The system relied on secrecy at every level. Dealers were pressured to stay quiet. Internal documents were classified and hidden. A parallel set of records was maintained, one for regulators showing compliance, one for internal use showing the truth. The company had maintained two sets of books for over 20 years. The scale was enormous. Eventually, Mitsubishi would admit to concealing defects in over 2 million vehicles worldwide. Some of those defects were minor annoyances. Others were potentially deadly. Executives were forced out. The president resigned in a ceremony featuring the deep bows that have become standard for Japanese corporate apologies. The company's stock collapsed. 40 Japanese prefectures and municipalities banned the purchase of Mitsubishi vehicles for government use. The scandal was supposed to be the end of it. Mitsubishi Motors promised reform, new management, new procedures, a commitment to transparency. But they hadn't come clean about everything. In January 2002, a wheel fell off a Mitsubishi truck on a highway in Yokohama. It bounced across lanes, struck a car, and then hit a pedestrian walking on the sidewalk. Her name was Masumi Okamoto. She was 29 years old. She had 2 young children. The impact killed her instantly. Police investigated. At first it seemed like a freak accident. Wheels fall off trucks sometimes. Maintenance failures happen. But the Yokohama police noticed something. There had been similar incidents with Mitsubishi trucks before. Wheels coming loose, hub assemblies failing, a pattern that suggested something more than random mechanical failure. They dug deeper. They found that Mitsubishi representatives had been visiting owners of trucks with wheel problems, quietly replacing parts and asking them not to report the issues publicly. They found internal documents showing the company knew about the defect. They found evidence that Mitsubishi had been covering up this specific problem while publicly claiming to have reformed after the 2000 scandal. In March 2004, police raided Mitsubishi offices. What they discovered expanded the scandal exponentially. The company had been hiding defects going back to the 1980s. Clutch problems, brake issues, fuel system flaws, across hundreds of thousands of vehicles. A systematic pattern of concealment that made the 2000 revelations look like a prelude. Former Mitsubishi president Katsuhiko Kawasoe was arrested. So were 3 other executives. They were charged with professional negligence resulting in death for failing to recall vehicles with known defects. In 2008, Kawasoe was convicted. He and his colleagues received suspended sentences, meaning none served jail time. But the conviction established something important. Corporate executives could be held personally responsible when their cover-ups cost lives. The total toll from Mitsubishi's concealment is unclear. At least 2 deaths were directly attributed to known defects, many more injuries, and countless near misses that never made the news. This wasn't one rogue employee. It wasn't a single bad decision made in a moment of weakness. It was institutional, a corporate culture that had prioritized reputation over safety for decades, that had chosen concealment over transparency repeatedly across multiple administrations despite multiple opportunities to come clean. The Friday conference companies had to bail out Mitsubishi Motors. Daimler Chrysler, which had bought a stake years earlier, hoping to help turn the company around, eventually walked away entirely. They had lost faith that Mitsubishi could change. For a moment, it seemed like Mitsubishi Motors might not survive. Then, 12 years later, it happened again. In April 2016, Nissan engineers noticed something strange. They were testing vehicles that Mitsubishi had built for them, small cars called the Days and Days Rooks. These were K-cars, ultra-compact vehicles popular in Japan for their low taxes and ease of parking. A key selling point was fuel efficiency. But the numbers didn't add up. Nissan's engineers ran their own tests. The fuel economy figures they measured were nearly 10% worse than what Mitsubishi had claimed. For cars marketed specifically on their efficiency, a gap that large was impossible to explain away as measurement error. Nissan demanded an explanation. Mitsubishi's engineers investigated internally, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. They had been cheating on fuel economy tests, not just for these vehicles, not just for a few years, for a quarter century. On April 20, 2016, Mitsubishi Motors held a press conference in Tokyo. President Tetsuro Aikawa stood before the cameras and bowed deeply. The gesture was familiar by now, the ritual apology that Japanese corporate executives perform when scandals erupt. Then he admitted the truth. Mitsubishi had been manipulating fuel economy data since 1991. The method was simple but effective. During testing, technicians inflated tire pressure beyond normal levels. This reduced rolling resistance, making the cars glide more easily and use less fuel. The test results looked impressive. The numbers that went into marketing materials were flattering. But real customers, driving real cars with real tires at normal pressure, got worse mileage than advertised. The discrepancy varied by model. For some vehicles, it was a few percent. For the K cars that Nissan had discovered, it was as high as 15%. Customers who had chosen Mitsubishi specifically for fuel efficiency had been deceived. Initially, the company said the problem affected 625,000 vehicles. Those were the K cars built since 2013. Then they looked deeper. A week later, Mitsubishi expanded the admission. 9 more models were affected, spanning their entire current domestic lineup. Then they looked even deeper. They had used improper testing methods on essentially every vehicle sold in Japan since 1991. Even the all-electric i-MiEV, which doesn't burn any fuel at all, had inflated efficiency ratings. The testing method they used wasn't even legal in Japan. It was approved in the United States, where Mitsubishi also sold vehicles, but Japanese regulations required a different approach. For 25 years, no one had caught the discrepancy. Or perhaps someone had known and chosen not to act. An outside panel of investigators examined the corporate culture that had produced this fraud. Their findings echoed the conclusions from the earlier defect scandal. This wasn't the work of a few bad actors in a testing lab. It was, in their words, a collective failure of Mitsubishi Motors as a whole, starting from the management. The panel found a company where employees couldn't push back against unrealistic demands from above, where different departments competed against each other instead of cooperating, where the pressure to meet targets overrode concerns about legality or ethics. The problem is not only with the testing, certification, or the development department, said one investigator. It's a systemic failure. Management set ambitious fuel economy targets without considering whether they were achievable. Engineers found that they couldn't meet those targets through legitimate means. Rather than go back to management and say the goals were impossible, they cheated, and no one stopped them. For 25 years. The pattern from the earlier scandal had repeated itself exactly. Pressure from above, deception at the working level, cover-up throughout the organization, and finally, exposure when outside parties noticed discrepancies that internal watchdogs had either missed or ignored. Mitsubishi's stock plunged. At one point, shares weren't trading at all because there were no buyers, only sellers trying to get out. The company lost over a third of its market value in days. This time, rescue came from an unexpected source. Nissan, the company whose engineers had discovered the cheating, stepped in with a massive investment. They purchased a controlling stake in Mitsubishi Motors, becoming the largest shareholder and effectively taking over management. It was a remarkable turn. The company that had exposed the fraud became the company's savior. Nissan CEO Carlos Ghosn promised to restore trust, rebuild quality, and modernize Mitsubishi's management culture. The scandal cost Aikawa his job. Other executives resigned. The company faced billions of yen in potential compensation claims, government fines, and reputational damage. A company that had survived the end of World War II, the dissolution of the Zaibatsu, and multiple near-death experiences was saved once again. But at what cost to its independence, its culture, its identity? And the question lingered. What else was hidden? What other secrets lived inside the culture of the 3 red diamonds? And what about the secrets that were never really hidden at all? In 2015, UNESCO approved a Japanese request to designate 23 industrial sites as World Heritage Locations. The sites celebrated Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, the period of rapid modernization that had transformed the country from a feudal backwater into a global power. One of those sites was Hashima Island, the same island where Mitsubishi had mined coal since 1890, the same island where Korean and Chinese forced laborers had worked and suffered and died during World War II. South Korea objected. The forced labor history couldn't be ignored, they argued. You couldn't celebrate Japanese industrialization without acknowledging its costs. Japan and South Korea negotiated. Japan agreed to acknowledge the forced labor history when presenting the sites. Their UNESCO representative stated that there were a large number of Koreans and others who were brought against their will and forced to work under harsh conditions in the 1940s at some of the sites. The designation was approved. Then something happened that surprised no one who had watched Mitsubishi's scandals unfold. Japan didn't keep its promise. The Industrial Heritage Information Center that Japan established to present the sites downplayed the forced labor history. Some displays seemed to deny it outright, presenting testimonials from people who said conditions weren't that bad. One Korean witness who was interviewed had been a child at the time and couldn't actually describe working conditions in the mines. In 2021, UNESCO formally criticized Japan for failing to fulfill its commitments. The World Heritage Committee deeply regrets that Japan hadn't properly informed visitors about forced labor at sites like Hashima. South Korea was furious. China was furious. Survivors and their descendants were furious. Mitsubishi Materials, the mining company that had operated Hashima, had previously apologized to Chinese forced laborers in 2016. They had paid compensation. They had agreed to build memorials. But Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the company that had used Korean forced labor at its shipyards, refused similar gestures. In 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court ordered the company to pay compensation to Korean victims. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries refused, claiming the issue had been settled by a 1965 treaty between the two countries. The dispute continues today. South Korean courts have authorized the seizure of Mitsubishi assets in Korea. Japan has responded with trade restrictions. The wounds of World War II remain open, picked at by legal battles and diplomatic disputes, with the three red diamonds at the center of the controversy. And through it all, Mitsubishi has continued to grow. In November 2023, something unusual happened in Tokyo. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries held a defense business briefing session, inviting journalists and analysts to discuss the company's military operations. This was rare. Japanese defense contractors typically avoid publicity. The legacy of World War II hangs heavy over any company that builds weapons in Japan. Even Mitsubishi, despite being the country's largest defense contractor, had long preferred to emphasize its civilian products. But things were changing. Japan's government, alarmed by China's military buildup and North Korea's nuclear program, had announced a massive increase in defense spending. The budget for fiscal years 2023 through 2027 would total 43.5 trillion yen, roughly 2.5 times the previous five-year plan. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was positioned to benefit enormously. The company currently builds fighter jets, helicopters, missiles, tanks, submarines, and warships for Japan's self-defense forces. They manufacture the F-15J under license from Boeing. They produce the Mitsubishi H-60 helicopter under license from Sikorsky. They are developing new standoff missiles that could strike targets over 1,000 kilometers away. In 2023, Japan awarded Mitsubishi contracts worth 378 billion yen to develop and produce upgraded cruise missiles and submarine-launched weapons. The company expects its annual defense revenue to double from roughly 500 billion yen to over 1 trillion yen within a few years. They're also participating in the Global Combat Air Program, a joint project with Britain and Italy to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet by 2035. For the first time, Japanese defense technology will be developed for export. The head of Mitsubishi's defense division explained the shift in attitude. The Japan Self-Defense Force's successful activities in the Great East Japan earthquake has significantly changed the public's view of the defense business. He had been with the company for 35 years. The atmosphere around defense work, he said, was much severer when he started. Now it was acceptable to discuss openly. The company that built the Zero fighter is building Japan's fighters of the future. The shipyard that launched the Musashi builds submarines and destroyers. The legacy continues. Three diamonds, still there, still expanding. Consumer advocacy groups in Japan have called on Mitsubishi to withdraw from weapons manufacturing and arms exports. Some argue that missiles capable of striking enemy bases violate Japan's pacifist constitution. Others point to the risk of weapons technology being transferred to third countries with poor human rights records. Mitsubishi hasn't commented directly on these concerns, but the contracts keep coming. The revenues keep growing. The three diamonds keep appearing on military hardware that Japan hopes will never be used. Let's count. 40 autonomous companies form the core of the modern Mitsubishi Group. They participate in the Friday conference, meeting monthly to coordinate without technically coordinating. 433 trillion yen in combined assets. Nearly 8% of all revenue from publicly traded Japanese companies flows through Mitsubishi entities. 29 major companies attend the Friday conference regularly. Another group of 10 rotates in on a monthly basis. The Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group is Japan's largest bank. Mitsubishi Corporation is one of the world's largest trading companies. Mitsubishi Electric builds everything from elevators to satellites. Mitsubishi Estate controls some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. Mitsubishi Chemical produces materials that go into countless products. Companies you might not realize are connected to Mitsubishi. Nikon, the camera maker, was founded with Mitsubishi funding in 1917. Kirin, one of Japan's largest breweries, is a Mitsubishi affiliate. Asahi Glass, now called AGC, produces the glass in buildings and vehicles worldwide. The group claims to feed approximately 1/4 of the entire Japanese population through its food production, transport, and distribution networks. Nearly 4,500 trademark registrations protect the three-diamond mark in over 140 countries. A special committee monitors unauthorized use and enforces brand standards. 155 years of continuous operation, from 3 aging steamships to a sprawling empire that touches virtually every aspect of modern life. This is the scale of Mitsubishi. Not a company, but a constellation. Not a corporation, but a system. And yet, there is no Mitsubishi headquarters, no single CEO, no unified leadership. The Iwasaki family lost control during the occupation. The holding company was dissolved. What remains is a network, a web of mutual shareholding and shared history, bound together by that monthly lunch and the 3 diamonds that appear on everything they make. Ask who runs Mitsubishi and you won't get a simple answer. The bank has its leaders. The trading company has its leaders. Heavy industries has its leaders. They coordinate, they cooperate, they support each other in crises, but there is no emperor sitting atop the pyramid. The Zaibatsu had a head. The Keiretsu has only a shared name. Is this strength or weakness? Resilience or vulnerability? When Mitsubishi Motors was drowning in scandal, the Friday conference companies rescued it. When the Yakuza tried to take over real estate holdings, the group rallied. The web of connections provides stability, a safety net against disaster. But the same structure that enables mutual support can enable mutual concealment. When problems emerge at one company, the incentive is to protect the brand, not to expose the truth. The 3 diamonds must be preserved. A culture of secrecy doesn't require conspiracy. It requires only shared interest. Today, you can visit Hashima Island. Tourist boats leave from Nagasaki, the same port where the Musashi was launched in secret 85 years ago. The journey takes about an hour. The island is a ruin now. Concrete apartment buildings, Japan's first reinforced concrete high-rises, crumble in the salt air. Vegetation pushes through broken windows. The seawall that once kept the ocean at bay is deteriorating. Tourists walk marked paths through the decay, viewing platforms offering glimpses of the island's industrial past. Tour guides explain how coal mining worked, how workers lived, how Mitsubishi developed undersea extraction techniques that were cutting edge for their time. At its peak in 1959, Hashima had a population density higher than anywhere else on Earth. Over 5,000 people lived on 16 acres, packed into buildings that rose from the rock like a battleship superstructure. That's why they called it Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. The guides talk about the movie filmed here, the James Bond villain's lair from Skyfall. They talk about the coal that fueled Japan's modernization. They talk about the engineering achievements. What they often don't talk about is the forced labor. The Korean and Chinese workers brought here against their will, the deaths, the suffering. A 2017 South Korean film, also called Battleship Island, dramatized the forced labor history. Japan criticized it as historically inaccurate. The controversy highlighted the vast gap between how the 2 countries remember the same events. When the tour boat returns to Nagasaki, visitors disembark near the Atomic Bomb Museum. The city that built the Musashi was destroyed by the weapon that ended the war the Musashi was built to win. History layers upon history. Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard still operates, building commercial vessels and naval ships. The company has been continuously present there for 140 years, through wars and disasters and corporate restructuring. Some things endure. What does Mitsubishi owe the world? This is not a question with an easy answer. Japanese courts have ruled differently than Korean courts. Chinese settlements have been reached while Korean claims remain unresolved. The 1965 treaty between Japan and South Korea was supposed to settle all claims, but victims argue that crimes against humanity cannot be so easily discharged. Mitsubishi Materials apologized to Chinese forced laborers in 2016, paid compensation, and funded memorial construction. It was the most comprehensive reconciliation agreement to emerge from East Asia's war reparations movement. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries has not made similar gestures to Korean victims. They maintain the legal position that the issue was resolved by treaty. The company that pioneered Japanese capitalism, that modernized an ancient society, that built some of the most impressive machines of the 20th century, cannot or will not fully acknowledge what happened in its mines and factories during the war. Or perhaps the problem is deeper. Perhaps acknowledging forced labor would require acknowledging a pattern. The Zero Fighter and the Musashi represented the pinnacle of Mitsubishi's wartime production. They were also built in part by people who had been enslaved. What do you do with a legacy like that? Some companies have confronted similar histories. German corporations have paid into compensation funds for Holocaust survivors. American companies have acknowledged their connections to slavery. The process is never complete, never satisfying to everyone, but there is movement. Mitsubishi exists in a different context. Japan's relationship with its wartime history is complicated by geopolitics, national identity, and a political culture that often prefers ambiguity to confrontation. The company cannot act entirely independently of the government, and the government has not pushed for comprehensive reconciliation. So the three diamonds continue to appear on cars and air conditioners and convenience stores. The Friday conference meets monthly, the assets grow, the revenues flow. And the past remains, like Hashima Island, slowly crumbling, but never quite disappearing. The last surviving forced laborers are dying. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to what happened in Mitsubishi's wartime operations. The history will become fully archival, a matter for scholars and diplomats rather than survivors and their families. Will that make reconciliation easier or harder? Ask the woman who was 15 when she was sent from Korea to work in a Mitsubishi factory in Nagoya. Ask the Chinese prisoner of war who descended into the coal mines of Hashima. Ask the family of the mother killed by a defective wheel that Mitsubishi had refused to recall. But time is running out to ask. What remains when the witnesses are gone? Documents, photographs, records, many destroyed, some preserved. The physical evidence of places like Hashima, the legal judgments and diplomatic agreements, the corporate structures that have outlived generations. And the three diamonds, registered in 140 countries, protected by a special committee, appearing on products that touch billions of lives. The son of a farmer who spent 7 months in prison for challenging authority built something that has lasted 155 years. Yataro Iwasaki created an organization that survived the Meiji era, 2 world wars, military occupation, forced dissolution, and repeated scandals. How do you judge such a legacy? You could focus on the achievements. The modernization of Japan, the ships and planes and factories that made a feudal society into an industrial power, the technologies that improved countless lives, the employment provided to hundreds of thousands of workers. You could focus on the costs, the forced laborers who died, the defects that killed customers, the decades of lies and cover-ups, the culture of secrecy that protected the brand at the expense of truth. You could focus on the present, the defense contracts, the nuclear energy projects, the global reach of a corporate empire that operates in virtually every major industry. But perhaps the most honest assessment is the simplest. Mitsubishi is what a company becomes when it ties itself to the state, when it grows large enough to shape history, when it endures long enough to accumulate both achievements and sins. The three diamonds mean different things to different people. To investors, they represent stability and returns. To customers, they represent quality and reliability. To historians, they represent a case study in corporate power. To survivors, they represent a debt that has never been fully paid. To Japan, they represent national capability. To competitors, they represent formidable opposition. The logo has remained essentially unchanged since the 1870s. 3 red diamonds arranged in a triangle, derived from the Iwasaki family crest and the crest of the Tosa clan. The name comes from 2 Japanese words, Mitsu, meaning 3, and Hishi, meaning water chestnut or diamond. 3 diamonds. Integrity, reliability, success. That's what the company says they represent. Or maybe they represent something else. The 3 eras of Mitsubishi: Meiji, wartime, post-war. The 3 pillars: government, industry, secrecy. The 3 responses to scandal: deny, apologize, continue. Symbols mean what we make them mean. On a winter morning in 1940, a ship slid into Nagasaki harbor behind a curtain of hemp rope. Residents were kept inside, forbidden from witnessing the launch. A wave flooded the streets. Guards pushed people back into their homes. Nothing to see here. The ship was so secret that its existence was classified. The workers who built it had sworn oaths of silence. The specifications were hidden even from Japan's own intelligence services. 85 years later, the Musashi lies on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, her wreck discovered by a team funded by a Microsoft billionaire. Tourists visit Hashima Island in daylight, photographing the ruins of the mining colony that once fueled the great battleship's construction. Some secrets come out eventually, others remain buried. Mitsubishi endures. The Friday conference meets. The three diamonds appear on products in 140 countries. The company that started with 3 aging steamships now controls assets exceeding 400 trillion yen. What will the next century bring? More growth, probably. More diversification. More defense contracts as Japan rearms. More electric vehicles as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. More scandals, perhaps, because institutions this large and this old carry their cultures forward, and cultures resist change. More 3 diamonds. The son of a farmer who lost his family's samurai status built an empire that outlasted empires. The company that armed Japan for war survived Japan's defeat. The zaibatsu that was dissolved reformed as a keiretsu. The brand that has weathered scandal after scandal remains instantly recognizable worldwide. There is no moral to this story, no neat conclusion, no final judgment that captures everything Mitsubishi has been and done and will become. There is only the weight of history pressing down on the present. There is only the 3-diamond logo appearing on another product, another building, another weapon system. There is only the question that every institution built on such foundations must eventually confront. What do you owe for what you were? Mitsubishi's answer so far has been to keep building, keep diversifying, keep growing, keep the Friday conference meeting, keep the 3 diamonds polished and prominent. The past is the past. The future is where the profits are. Maybe that's the brutal truth about Japan's most secretive corporation. Not any single scandal, not any particular atrocity, not any specific cover-up. The brutal truth is simpler. They built an organization that can survive anything: wars, occupations, dissolutions, deaths, scandals, legal judgments, international condemnation. They built an organization that endures. And as long as it endures, those 3 red diamonds will mean whatever Mitsubishi wants them to mean. Integrity, reliability, success, or something else entirely depending on who you ask. The tourists are boarding the boat back from Hashima now. The concrete buildings crumble a little more each year. The waves lap against the deteriorating seawall. And somewhere, in boardrooms and factories and banks across Japan and around the world, the business of Mitsubishi continues. 3 diamonds, 55 years, still standing. If you found this investigation valuable, consider subscribing. There are other stories waiting to be told, other institutions whose histories deserve examination. Leave a comment telling me which corporate empire you'd like to explore next. The past shapes the present. Understanding how helps us shape the future. Until next time.